All right, my name is Dr. Stuart Malcolm. I am a doctor here at Rhythm, and I am going to give a lecture, and I'm titling it 2 years on lessons from being a long COVID doctor. So I have been a long COVID doctor only, and I do treat ME/CFS as well, and that's all combined within long COVID. But I've been dedicated in doing long COVID for the past 2 years, and I really wanted to give a reflection on what those 2 years have been like and what I've learned. So let's begin. So when we do talks in medicine, we try to make it as academic as possible. So I'm going to put up two learning objectives. I'm going to divide this lecture into two. One is a discussion on the mitochondria and its relation to what's happening in long COVID. And then two is really just my experience as a long COVID doctor, lessons for patients and other clinicians. So this lecture is really more about just some thoughts. If you're a clinician and you're tuning in, you might not necessarily learn how to treat long COVID. If you're a patient, you might not, get a specific thing to try, but it's really kind of what I want to kind of tell people from what it's been like being a long COVID doctor the last few years. So let's start with the mitochondria. So what I joke with my patients is we learn about this in high school. It's the powerhouse of the cell. And what the mitochondria is this tiny little organelle that lives inside the cell. So right here, you can see the cell, and in it, you've got the nucleus. We have the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and a lot of other stuff. There's lots of stuff inside the cell, and the cell is where things happen. Okay, this is where biochemistry happens and where life happens. So the mitochondria was actually, when we were evolving from single-celled organisms, was actually another bacteria that another cell engulfed. So, this is, what we think happened. And so the mitochondria in itself actually has its own DNA, and you actually inherit that from your mom. So, moving on. So you inherit that from your mom. The mitochondria is involved in energy processes. And so what I tell patients is it is the powerhouse of the cell. You make 90% of your ATP. ATP is the universal currency for energy. So often folks will tell me, I'm really tired, I have post-exertional malaise. What I want to tell patients, though, it's not just about that. It's not just about how you feel tired or whatnot. It's really that the cell needs ATP in order for things to happen. So biochemical reactions from A to B, you need ATP for those things to work. So it's not just about being fatigued. It's really about kind of life in itself. And this is why we eat, why we consume food, and why we breathe oxygen is really for the mitochondria to function and to make things happen. So we've known simply because the mitochondria has, been a part of cells from, since the beginning of time. Infections like viruses and bacteria and funguses, they actually usurp the power of the mitochondria. So they come in there and they kind of wall themselves off with the mitochondria, and that's because they're trying to maximize on this energy. So we know that this has happened. So when we think about long COVID, we really need to know what has happened in the past, and we know that this is something that's happened in other infections. But this is a long COVID lecture. So I first need to make an aside, which is the statement, long COVID is a vascular inflammatory disease. It starts off that way. And there is a lot of data about that. So this really kind of started with Bruce Patterson's work with the cytokine profile, showing that there was vascular inflammation. But we have had so many data points that come out about this. So this is a paper that came out of the United Kingdom showing impaired exercise capacity in association with that, with worsening, clotting labs, essentially. And then the data came out of Western University in Ontario showing that Ang1 and P-selectin, which are vascular inflammatory biomarkers, can actually define long COVID. And then finally, I'm giving this lecture in March of 2024, is that this was published in Science Journal in January 2024, that we know there is persistent vascular inflammation that's going on in long COVID. But what I tell my patients is that in a disease that has more than 200 different symptoms, is that the major thing that's going on? Did that actually happen to you and it has resolved? And how do we figure that out in each case? But what the other big thing is if the vascular inflammation has occurred, what are the downstream effects of that? Is there inflammation that has gone then to the tissues? Is it relating to oxygen uptake or nutrient uptake? There's a lot that you need to consider. But this lecture is not about vascular inflammation, but I can't give a long COVID lecture if I don't mention that first. So this is mitochondria. So I want to do a little bit of teaching in terms of like how I view this as a, what I want my patients to understand. And so we eat food, we take in glucose. At the very top here, it's small, but you can see here that we consume glucose. It goes through these processes, and then it's imported into the cell, okay, and into the mitochondria. And how that actually happens is through this channel MPC. Okay. And then what happens is it goes through pyruvate and it goes through this cycle. And so you can see very small here, it's called the citric acid cycle or TCA cycle. It goes by different names. It actually goes by like the Krebs cycle, but it's a very important thing. And, we spent decades as scientists to figure out this process. And as an undergraduate and as a medical student, I had to memorize every single step that went into that. And then the point of all these steps is that it then feeds the mitochondrial complexes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 specific nutrients in order for to establish something called the electrochemical gradient. So over here, we can see TAG. So this is really kind of how we process fats. So we process fats, we bring it in, and it goes through something called beta oxidation, and it ends up spitting out a molecule called acetyl-CoA that then goes through this process. So I'm missing out on proteins here, but proteins also feed into this process, and I'm going to talk about that later in the lecture. But really what I want my patients to understand is I am making molecules that the mitochondria electron transport chain right here uses in order to make ATP. So ATP is made, and that is how we get stuff done in the cell. So looking over here, right here, oxygen, right beside step 4, that's why we breathe as living creatures. We take in oxygen in order for that last step to push forward. And what is known in long COVID? So there was a paper that did come out at the end, kind of like October, December of 2022, that showed us what happened during an acute COVID infection. Okay. And what happened is specifically this channel here, MPC, and this step here, step 1 of the mitochondrial cascade, was inhibited by COVID. Okay, so let's explore a little bit more details about what happens in the mitochondria as a result from long COVID. So the paper that I'm going to jump to now is this paper that was published in January of 2024. And what this paper did is they took patients who got COVID and they separated them out on people who recovered from COVID, who didn't develop long COVID, and those people who got long COVID. And they took a muscle biopsy of them, and then they made them crash. And so anyone with long COVID kind of understands what PEM or post-exertional malaise is. But essentially it's where you exert yourself either from physical activity or emotional or kind of any type of work, thinking, stress, anything, and then you get a crash of symptoms kind of soon after. And they looked at the muscle biopsies before and after, and I want to investigate a little bit about what this found. So let's go back one slide, and I want to really focus on step 2. So step 2, which is right here, is this step right here, which is SDH, or succinate dehydrogenase. It converts succinate to fumarate. And so we already know from the previous study I said is that step 1 and this channel were inhibited. But what this paper will show is that during a crash, step 2 is also inhibited. So let's look here. So here's one of their slides, and we can look at this activity, succinate dehydrogenase activity, that at baseline, so the white box with all the little white circles in it, those are patients who had recovered from long COVID. And then red, those are the patients with long COVID. And at baseline, they were on average normal. But then when we stress out the body and make the body crash, what should happen is the body saying, hey, give me a little bit more, ATP. I just used up a bunch of ATP doing exercise. Let's bump up this activity. And that's what we see in the control or white box, okay? But what happens in long COVID patients is it actually drops. Now, the thing that I really outlined to my patients, though, is it's still an average. So look at this recovered patient right here. Their succinate dehydrogenase activity does not work as well as perhaps this person. So the way we think about long COVID is that it's not going to be the same for everyone, but this does give us a clue as to what might potentially be going on. So I wanted to jump to this figure here, which is showing us kind of how steps in the mitochondria are and energy kind of production occur. So looking right here, you can see glucose is red. So this isn't a muscle biopsy, and at baseline you can see it's upregulated. That we have more glucose in the cell, and that's actually not something that I see in every patient. Some patients actually have dysregulated glucose uptake, and that's for several reasons. But as you go down, you can see in this pathway down to pyruvate, it's blue, meaning low. And then as it's imported into the cell, you can see that several of these intermediates are all blue, meaning that it's low. So this is good evidence that there's something going on in terms of how we are getting these metabolites into the cell and how we're processing it and how we're making energy from it. So one thing that I really wanted to jump to next was really talking about the interplay of the mitochondria and these cycles and how the body will then compensate. So this was a paper that came out of the University of Alberta in January 2024, so quite recently, is that they took the blood of a whole bunch of long COVID patients and they wanted to see what was kind of upregulated. So this is a plot of this, and I want us to kind of focus right here on alanine, aspartate, and glutamate metabolism, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to shift over to this image right here. So this is called the biochemical pathways, and it is from a company called Roche. So Roche is a pharmaceutical company. I think they're out of Switzerland. And I remember reaching out to them actually like 2 years ago, being like, hey, I really need one of your posters because I need to think about what's going on in the mitochondria. So, thank you to that team for sending me a poster, but let's look at it together. So this is the citric acid cycle in a little bit more detail, this nice circle here. And I want to kind of go over here to pyruvate. And so pyruvate comes in and enters into acetyl-CoA and goes through this big cycle that as humans, we figured out the cycle and how it works. Obviously, we learn more like every day. But let's look up here. You can see L-aspartate then comes into oxaloacetate right here. And then we can see that L-aspartate was one of the things that is, the metabolism is upregulated in long COVID. So one thing that could be happening is that we're trying to really digest or use up this amino acid. So aspartate is an amino acid that we get from protein. We can also look down here, which is glutamate, which is the other thing that I had circled in the previous slide, is that the metabolism is also upregulated here. So going back to my lecture, I want you all to see that aspartate kind of goes into oxaloacetate. Well, what's some of the data? So that's the image there. What's some of the data? So this is a clinical trial that did show that oxaloacetate supplementation for patients with ME/CFS and long COVID who had fatigue actually felt improvement when we gave this. So I have used a lot of oxaloacetate actually for my patients. And in some patients, they actually do tell me it really helps them with their fatigue. But in other patients, it doesn't do anything. And what I would say, it's probably because in their pathways, there's some sort of deficiency in their oxaloacetate, whereas in other patients, that is not what is going on. So let's move on from there. So what I really want to propose is that there is something going on to the mitochondria. We know this. But is the question that COVID is binding to these mitochondrial proteins and damaging it directly? So there's lots of data out there. We know that mitochondrial genes are downregulated during a COVID infection. Is that because of the pathways going into there, or because the proteins are affected? And there's lots of stuff coming out and how the mitochondria are affected. Or is it the result of microclotting? So, the first aside that I had was like, hey, remember, don't forget about the microclotting. And so there was this paper that showed that mitochondrial metabolism is downregulated. But then when you treat with factor 10A inhibitor, so factor 10A is in the long kind of clotting cascade that we use as humans to make clots, that if we treat with that the mitochondrial metabolism actually improves itself. So that could be what's going on. Or is it something else that we're not thinking about? So what came across my desk quite recently, so this is International Long COVID Awareness Day. This came out just 2 weeks ago, is this iron dysregulation. And so what this paper showed is in several hundred patients, they looked at the level of iron in long COVID patients soon after they developed COVID. And they found that iron was being dysregulated. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out is that in my patients, the ferritin, which is the storage molecule of iron, is not actually very high, which they saw in this paper, but it actually becomes really low. And it's because we're inhibiting the iron transporter. So that's one thing that I'm going to review with, at the end of the lecture, and just kind of talk about, we need to make sure that we're checking our iron, but we do see that a lot. And the data is finally coming out. Things that we're seeing in our patients, we're starting to explain this from very good evidence. Okay. So I wouldn't be a good long COVID doctor if I wasn't also following one of my favorite longevity doctors. And so this is an email that I, kind of got from a guy named Peter Attia, and he was actually looking at a specific paper, looking at iron metabolism. And so what this was actually looking at was iron metabolism in the skeletal muscle, and it wasn't in patients with long COVID. Again, this is longevity. This is about patients who are trying to optimize their bodies and exercise to their fullest. But they looked at iron deficiency in patients, and what they concluded is that really iron is such an important cofactor, even when you don't have anemia. So anemia is when you get a low level of a specific nutrient, or you lose blood such that your red blood cells drop. Even when you don't have that and you just have iron deficiencies, when you supplement it, it results in better clearance of lactate and a better ability to kind of like really exert energy. So I highlighted this kind of just sentence here. Iron is a critical role cofactor in the class of proteins known as cytochromes, which are key components of the electron transport chain, which I just mentioned, of oxidative phosphorylation, that process of giving the body food to go through this process in order to make ATP happen. If an individual is iron deficient, cytokine expression or activity may be lower, promoting a larger shift towards glycolysis, meaning breaking down glucose to try to make that pyruvate, particularly as lactate accumulates during intense exercise. So this isn't a long COVID patient. These are patients who want to optimize themselves, but that's what we have to do in long COVID, is we have to see where other research is going. And I just think that it's interesting that in the last 2 weeks, we're getting papers about the iron, which is what I'm seeing clinically as a long COVID doctor. And then how does that fit into this process? But that question isn't so simple, because what else could be going on? So this I borrowed from an Australian researcher who is looking at, who's finding actually that cobalt, for example, can actually really help with hemoglobin, which is the carrier of iron and oxygen. So I kind of joke with my patients, I used to be a chemistry major, I'm a doctor, but the number of times that I ever thought about cobalt as a cofactor is literally zero. but that's long COVID. It makes us reconsider what we know and that we have to push the boundaries. So this was a study that showed that administering cobalt actually resulted in improvement in hemoglobin, and it helps with iron regulation, essentially. But nothing comes free. And so one thing that I always want to bring up was this paper that came out in the Lancet about, I think just, well, actually right now. But what it showed is that it was a great trial, a randomized control trial that showed improvement in long COVID fatigue and brain fog in patients who were treated with a prebiotic probiotic focusing on bifidobacter. The problem is if you have, some sort of dysbiosis or bad bacteria there, if I give you a lot of iron, would that actually make that dysbiosis worse? And then I point out this paper as well, which is we find levels of, or evidence of fungal translocation that happen in long COVID. So how is this a disease where you have microclotting and vascular inflammation and mitochondrial damage and dysbiosis and translocation of fungal elements? And I think the argument that you need to understand is that the illness, long COVID, is not just this static thing. One thing happens and it has a downstream effect, and we need to understand that. And unfortunately, when we give something, it might affect another aspect of this illness. All right, my name is Dr. Stuart Malcolm. I